evening and welcome to the work session of the Richmond Community Schools Board of School Trustees. And if you would all please join me in the pledge to the flag.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, thank you. If we could have the reading of our mission statement, please.
Richmond Community Schools guide students on pathways of learning to a future of limitless possibilities.
And the vision statement.
Richmond Community Schools, a community nurturing mind, body, and spirit to prepare students for lives of choice, purpose, and service.
Thank you so much for filling in. I appreciate that. We are to our first session of public commentary. Is there anyone signed up? Okay. Then we're on our consent items.
All right. Our consent items for your consideration this evening are the approval of the minutes from last meeting, 3.01 and 3.02, Human Resources, with the addendum that you found at your desk this evening.
Okay, do I have a motion to approve the consent items? Motion from Aaron
I move to
Steve.
approve the consent items with the addendum.
Thank you. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Okay, second from Brad. Any comments or questions? All those in favor of approving the consent items signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Hearing none opposed. And I need to suspend the meeting and open our first public hearing for the additional appropriation. That hearing is now open. The purpose of this hearing is to offer the public an opportunity for comments and questions regarding the additional appropriation for the proceeds of the 2018 general obligation bonds. Karen Scalf, Chief Financial Officer, will present this information, and we will invite comments and questions at the conclusion of each portion of this presentation.
Okay, good evening. This hearing is with regard to the 2018 general obligation bonds, in which the board had approved issuance this fall. All of the notices have been published in accordance with state statute, and it is now the time in which we can open for the public anytime to ask questions regarding this additional appropriation.
Okay.
The amount of the appropriation is not to exceed $5 million.
Okay, do we have any comments from our public? Questions? Hearing none, we will close the public hearing. I do need a motion to close this
I
public
will
hearing.
motion to close the public hearing portion.
Okay, do I have a second?
I second it.
All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, now I need to,
For the record, Madam Chairman, we do have a publisher's affidavit showing that proof of publication of the notice of
oh,
public
thank
hearing.
you, I do appreciate that.
So it'll become a part of the minutes or a copy of it.
Okay. And then we have a second public hearing that I am going to declare open as well. And the purpose of this hearing is to offer the public an opportunity for comments and questions regarding the 2019 through 2021 capital projects plan, the 2019 through 2023 school bus replacement plan, and the 2019 budgets. Karen Scalf, Chief Financial Officer, will present this information, and we will invite questions at the conclusion of this presentation.
Sorry, there's a glare.
We want to let you know the reason we don't have it up on the other two screens is over the weekend with the storms. Lightning knocked out our switcher, and so
Oh,
we
nice.
didn't realize until earlier this afternoon that these are not working, so apologize for the inconvenience there, and we'll have it fixed for next board meeting.
Okay, so Tonight it is the time in which we have a public hearing regarding our 2019 budgets. And we will do a review of our funds and touch some highlights of the budget, as well as discuss numerous changes that have occurred this year with the processes and forms and the budget structure that we'll be looking at in January when this budget comes into effect. So currently we have 6 what we call taxing funds, and those are the general fund, debt service fund, pension bond fund, capital projects fund, transportation and bus replacement funds. These are statutory funds that are in place. The general fund is revenue that we receive from the state basic grant, as well as a few other state and local funds that we receive. Debt service, pension bond, capital projects, transportation, and bus replacement all receive revenue from income tax and real and personal property taxes. There are some primary uses that are associated with each of the funds. The general fund is mostly for salaries and benefits, insurance and utilities, supplies, some equipment, and all instructional and curricular expenses associated with schools. Debt service is to repay corporate debt. Retirement severance is to repay corporate pension bond debt. Capital projects are for building maintenance costs, some utilities, some insurance as far as real and casualty property insurance, district technology equipment and infrastructure, as well as copiers and some emergency costs in capital nature. Transportation costs are for those services or costs associated strictly with the transport of students, and bus replacement is any cost of purchasing new buses. The rainy day fund is also considered a taxing fund. However, taxes are not generated for this fund. This fund is only from transfers from other funds and must be a one-time purchase in order to qualify for use. In January 2019, we will see an overhaul of our funds that has been enacted with House Bill 1009, and those funds will now become the Education Fund, the Debt Service Fund, Pension Bond, and Operations Fund. The Education Fund will be strictly for any costs associated with academic achievement and student support. The focus will be on dollars to the classroom applicable expenses. There is no change to debt service, as well as no change to pension bond or retirement severance. The Operations Fund will now become what was the Transportation, Bus Replacement, and Capital Projects Funds, as well as have some costs that were originally in the general fund for what is deemed overhead in non-educational expenses. Those areas are custodial, central office, administration, board costs, and maintenance services. Technology costs are a little bit of both funds, so if they are instructional or classroom oriented, they may remain in the education fund. If they are infrastructure related or administrative, those have to stay in operations. The rainy day fund, there is no change. That still has to be a one-time expense directed by the board, and it still is revenue generated strictly by transfers from other taxing funds.
Do you want questions at the end or as we go through?
We can go. We can do it as we go.
Because I realize this is a public hearing, but the part within the operational, we've actually have a big shift coming because we had a lot of our maintenance overhead or expense and that type of stuff was actually in the general fund.
Correct.
Which was purposely done when we went back and borrowed and created the severance to pay for or
Right.
And that was one of the ways that we could shift some of the savings and make sure that we were able to retain it and that not be. So when I see the term up there, primary uses, does that primary use means you are definitely limited to that?
Yes. The statutory code has provided very defined rules as to what can and cannot be in those funds. The State Board of Accounts went through and redefined the chart of accounts in which we use, and the entire chart focused on maintenance of buildings and custodial services is now in the operations fund. There are no accounts even available to utilize in that education fund.
So then, would it make sense for us, because this all takes place January 1 of 2019, correct?
Correct.
So would it make sense for us to take a look at before we get to the end of the year, because we're going to have to eventually transfer monies between these funds,
Correct.
So should we maybe, before we get to the end of the year, talk about the intent of how we had some of those overhead expenses and maybe figure out?
So I mentioned in the agenda meeting update was that at some point, and Karen and I talked about when that needed to happen, that we will have to have a conversation about intent and timing and, right?
Right, exactly. So the new structure also requires that there's no change to the revenue coming into the education fund from the basic grant. 100% has to be deposited into the education fund, and then on a monthly, quarterly, semi-annually, or annual basis, you have the ability to transfer from the education fund to the operations fund, or vice versa, to cover those costs which were originally in the old general fund that now are in the operations fund. So when we looked at our budget, and this is budget, so it's appropriation, you had to break out all of those costs in those account numbers, and when we did that, we end up with a budget in the operations fund of $6,457,870 that shifted. So that's your custodial costs, that's your maintenance costs. I did leave most of the technology staff in the education fund because they actually touch classrooms every day, and they are very important to our curricular and instructional area, so they will stay.
We have another year, don't we, before our pension bonds pay out, is it 2020?
Right?
Yeah.
So are we to assume then that levy neutrality is going to have to come solely from the operations?
Yes, that's correct. And we will go over that a little bit more, a little bit later, but that is something to keep in mind. As we look at the budget, some of those numbers look very high because of the factors like levy neutrality. So when we look in total at the transition between general fund to this new education fund and operations fund, we're looking at about a breakout of 18% of our budget in the, if we were to take the 18 fund, moving it to the 19, that we're gonna have to transfer. So in thought process, very layman's terms, we're looking at about an 18% need for transfer throughout the year.
That was education to operational, right?
Correct. And those transfers are not automatic. The board will have to pass a resolution, so we do have to have further conversation on that to know what the preference is. I would highly recommend that we look at it on a monthly basis, but we have a couple of options on how that monthly transfer can look, and we can discuss those further in the future.
Does DLGF have to approve,
They do not, as long as a resolution is passed.
as long as the board adopts?
Correct. Okay, so what are our next steps? Once we get to the point where we are ready for adoption, this meeting will go through resolutions that will establish these new funds. Those are required before January 1st of 2019. I would like to take care of that tonight so that they're established as we're working on our budget and going for adoption next meeting. There is more to do, and that is one thing we can take care of tonight. January 1st, 2019, we will transfer the remaining cash balance of general fund to the education fund. We will end with a zero balance on December 31st of all of the old funds, and we'll start January 1 with the new funds and the new balances. Before March 1st of 2019, we need to determine what portion of the general fund cash balance that was transferred to education is actually attributable to the operations portion of the operations fund. We need to transfer cash from education to the operation fund throughout the year. As we've discussed, we'll determine that in the future. And then just some changes in the budget prep that we need to be aware of as we look toward adoption. There are some drastic changes to some of the forms that the DLGF requires. There are CPF plan changes, most based on capital assets over $10,000. We'll cover that in just a little bit. And the bus replacement plan goes from a 5-year plan to a 12-year plan. There is a big difference in advertising this year. We only had to advertise the CPF and bus replacement plans on our local website. We did not have to advertise those in the newspaper, so we did save just a little bit of money there. So that was a good change for us, maybe not for the newspaper. Okay. Just to take, whoa, we're going crazy here. Sorry, guys. Take a look at the overall budget. We do have a budget in each of the funds, as well as a levy prepared. These are high. We will come in lower when we get our 1782. That is the norm when you advertise. The rainy day, we are budgeting $600,000 for the purchase of school buses. I do not know yet what that levy is going to look like in school bus replacement. That is all under construction with all of these changes, and I'd like to be prepared. This would save us an additional appropriation next year, and it's like we did this year, hoping we don't have to use it. We just don't know yet what that's going to look like. Debt service, we have a budget of $2 million. This is in accordance with what we've discussed throughout the issuance of bonds conversation. And our levy would still remain around the 1.5 mark. That is not a change from previous years. However, that budget looks high in order to make all of those things happen with a steady tax rate and that bond issuance. Pension debt looks much as it has in past years. We have a budget of $1.7 million. This is the levy neutrality factor that Mr. Cross referred to earlier in this hearing. And the levy for that is also $1.5 million. We will look to spend down some of our cash balance next year as we are just wrapping up that pension bond debt. The education fund, we're looking at a budget of $32,674,000. We do not actually have a levy in that fund. However, for advertisement purposes, the forms have to enter it. So that actually will not show on any of our budget order information when the state releases that, but it is a part of the calculation. Operations fund has a budget of $19,989,569. This is very different from our former capital projects fund. The levy shows $15,458,470. That is also partly funded by that former general fund, basic grant money in the tune of about $6.4 million. And the rest will be transportation, bus replacement, capital projects. So our total budget that we've advertised is $56,989,356. Some notes again, just to remind everybody, the education fund will not actually receive a levy. It is state basic grant funded, and the operations fund advertises a levy with the levy neutrality and tax cap impact as a part of the numbers. So to discuss some breakouts in the operation fund, I thought for the sake of all of us who are used to the old way, we would take a look at the individual sections contained in the operations fund, as well as an overhead view of the education fund. This is the simplest way to look at it, is what we all are used to, and we need to continue to plan in that direction so that we can maintain our costs for each area in a fiscally responsible manner. So some big changes in the bus replacement plan. We now transition to a 5-year plan budget rather than a 12-year. Here at RCS, we will continue to maintain a 12-year planned replacement, as that schedule really has not changed through statute. You still have to hang on to your buses 12 years with all of the required inspection pieces coming. The board made some changes to our replacement plan earlier this year to have a more equitable plan throughout the years. So this 5-year strategy has worked well for us in that we did everything ahead. So it really did make sense this year when we built the plan to go that way. The DLGF will recalculate our operations fund maximum levy, and that max levy will drive the allocation of appropriation to the school bus replacement plan by the DLGF. There are some unknowns yet about how that will work. The DLGF is not actually looking at our plans specifically, so we're not sure how that levy is going to work itself out when it comes to the specific areas. So I'll have more information once we get our 1782s. I just don't have it right now. So we had to plan for the worst, and that's why we have rainy day allocation this year as well. The capital projects area of the fund is the largest area, and that is the tune of about $98,000. Of that, 1.7 is levy neutrality, so that will come off the top at 1782 time. The tax cap income or impact is required by the DLGF to be reported as both appropriation as well as a loss. So 2.611363 is what they have us at for tax cap. What I will tell you, we have not hit that number yet. Our highest tax caps have hovered around the 1.8 million mark. I don't really expect it to be that high. I don't see a huge loss to our AV, or I hope there's not a huge loss to AV, and I don't know that there is a tremendous amount of board or bond action around our local units that would drive that to the extent that it would cause that kind of number to hit us. So some other parts to the fund that are a lot more applicable to us for actual dollars and cents calculations. The professional services area is a little bit high. It will be cut if we do not get appropriation, and it will be cut a little bit anyway, probably because by then we will know exactly what projects we will be doing with our bond issuance, and some of those service areas won't be needed in capital projects. We'll use bond money for that. So I expect that number to go down. Utilities and insurance, that will stay the same. You will see that number is higher than in previous years. There is one extremely positive thing with this drastic change, and that's that the operations fund now receives the growth quotient 100% across the fund. This year, that's 3.5%. That is pretty huge because capital projects has always been limited and not been able to use that growth quotient for growth in levy. Building improvement, we've set aside dollars of $1.8 million. Building equipment, $490,000, and that's what you would call mobile equipment. That is building level equipment, technology, or classroom furniture. Emergency dollars have been set aside in the amount of $600,000. We do not use all of these funds on an annual basis. Next year, there are some limitations to the way that you can utilize your funds, and the emergency funds will truly have to be that. We won't be able to use them as we have in the past, unless it really is an emergency. Technology and copiers, $845,000. That is our old norm. The technology fund used to receive $700,000 before we had the prior bond issuance, and next year they will not have the $350,000 from the bond money that has been part of their annual allocation. So $700,000 has been put back as their total in the capital projects fund. So Our total budget, less our levy neutrality and our tax cap impact, really puts us at a budget for capital of about $5.7 million. This is about a norm number for us on an annual basis. However, our cash never reflects that. And so we will see that number go down in actual expenses. Transportation, we have a budget set aside of $2,542,830. That dollar amount will cover bus aids at our local schools and a portion of the operations director's salary, associated benefits for those salaries, as well as all of the contractual services with student transit for our student transport. The other piece to the operations fund is what I call the former general fund costs. It's the remainder of our utilities insurance, which will make 100% of utilities and insurance a part of the operations fund. Custodial costs, maintenance costs, central office and school board, accepting out curricular staff and technology support staff. They will stay in the education fund as their duties relate strictly to the classroom. Civic Hall will go to operations, as well as any non-instructional supplies and equipment. Again, those are your custodial supplies, some of your technology needs, and some of your furniture equipment.
What's this little dude right over here doing?
He's a custodian.
He looks terrified.
It's a lot of changes for him. A little nervous about this.
Is that Jerry?
Okay, so the largest fund in our budget is the education fund, which, as naturally should be with a school, most of your money goes straight to the classroom. All of our instructional salaries, benefits, supplies, equipment, and professional development will all be located in this fund. Principals, building level secretaries, and student support staff will be located in the education fund. Our curricular directors and their staff will be in this fund, as well as instructional technology, equipment, and support staff. This truly will now reflect dollars to the classroom. We have always, the goal I think is, they used to call it the 63% solution or 65% solution. We are always more like the 70%. So our numbers are good when it comes to how much we put straight into our classroom. The rainy day fund. We have allocated $600,000 to our rainy day fund for appropriation for the purchase of buses if we need it. As we discussed last year, we have some fairly expensive costs these next couple of years. We had some lapses in when the time came that they distributed the levy amounts, and when our lower years of replacement were. So we have some pretty heavy hitting years before we could, what I would call, catch up in actually cash reserves being able to help offset our costs. We are still a little bit away from that. We don't know yet, like I said, how this levy is going to work. It may work itself out, but I don't know. So I'd like us to be prepared to have everything ready to go. The other reason is because now when we order buses, if we do not have the buses ordered by the end of January, we may not get them by the end of the calendar year, not just the school year. So that provides us a lot of trouble when it comes budget time, a lot of trouble when it comes to writing checks in December if we don't have invoices and we don't have buses to pay for. So in any possible way that we can, I need to avoid that problem. It doesn't look good on an audit, and it's really hard to explain to the Department of Local Government Finance because they don't do that every day. And
So they don't want us to, we can't encumber them over the year anymore? Into the next year?
I cannot encumber. We don't have a fund anymore. I don't have a bus replacement fund. I have an operations fund coming January 1. So I can't encumber in a bus replacement fund because it doesn't exist anymore.
Huh.
So I don't like to encumber in December for things we're going to purchase in the calendar year 2019 on buses because of the levy being so exact with that plan. I don't know that that's, it doesn't show 100% to our taxpayers that we plan to purchase buses this year, we encumbered them the year before. It gets really confusing, and I'd rather just keep it very neat and tidy.
Well, I
So-
mean, we're gonna run into cases that manufacturers have delays and processes create delays. I mean, so if we can't encumber, then what are our choices? Transfer the money to rainy day fund and then reallocate it, reappropriate it the next year?
Probably, or if we're super close on timing, writing the check and holding it. I mean, I don't really like to do that either, but if we're close on it's a few days, we do have to have checks ready the day we take delivery. So I have to plan ahead a lot in writing these checks, because they actually already they'll call me about a month ahead and say, I need you to have a check on or before this date. And then I usually have to write the check a month before, so that any day they show up with that bus, I can get it out to the bus garage. So there's a lot of planning that goes to bus purchases that I think that, especially this year, I know we're not going to be able to encumber. Another year when it's not an issue with the change to funds, maybe. It will just depend. The other piece to that, Mr. Slifer brings up a good point. We've always had encumbrances that roll from year to year in general fund and capital projects fund. We don't have that this year. So all purchase orders that are outstanding will have to be cut off and then stopped. And then we'll reorder purchase orders in January for the things that are still remaining due. So we have actually already communicated to our buildings about the timeline for cutoff on purchasing, and those timelines have to be very strict this year because we cannot have anything outstanding. There won't be anything that we encumber now or in October that's going to happen in March, because I cannot do that this year. I don't even have a fund to encumber it under anymore. So there's a number of
Well,
processes with
you
this.
do have the rainy day fund.
We do, but I don't know if you would like to have to do additional appropriations for everything. So we
Well,
I will hold
just,
you to that.
as someone that sits there and runs a business, for the state to come and create rules that just doesn't function in real life just blows me away.
Yeah.
It's gonna be a different year. We are doing everything we can now to make sure that transition happens as smoothly as possible, but there will be huge delays for the buildings. It will be very slow compared to previous years, and we already are slow in January because you have to close out and start up. And so it's gonna take a lot of work and a lot of planning. That's why we've already let everybody know. We're gonna pull that date up on purchasing and make sure you plan to have whatever you need to make that happen. So it's working. We're getting purchase orders like crazy. So, but it is going to be different this year. Okay, just some major highlights and kind of review. Education funds for curriculum and instruction. We'll remember it's dollars to the classroom. Might not have to do reports anymore like we used to. The other part is that the operations fund does contain capital projects, transportation operating, bus replacement, and general fund expenses. The operations fund will hold all of our utilities and property insurance now, and the operations fund levy is calculated considering the annual growth quotient, and it will be quite a bit different than we're used to. The other big thing to talk about is our tax rate. In 2018, our tax rate for all of our funds was 65.11 cents. I do not expect major changes to this rate in 2019, as long as the following factors don't change much: assessed value, property tax deductions, and tax cap impact. The auditor's office has already provided the certified net AVs to the Department of Local Government Finance, and there is not a substantial change over last year on what they have certified. So unless there's some major differences in
Hopefully it's larger.
very minimally. So as long as there are not major changes to those requests for assessment change, we shouldn't see too drastic a change in our tax rates. So now is the time to open the hearing for any questions from the public.
I don't know what
those acronyms mean. Yeah, well, I have said them as we went, so, they're. I have no question. Very well. Okay. Then
Our
we
public
will
has no questions.
proceed. Are there any questions from the board?
I still don't get where the encumbered, the funds that used to be encumbered, you can't get, if you have a budget and you're supposed to use up this, use it up, but it's hard to do it, there's gonna be something over or under.
Timing.
So, it doesn't change the cash balance, right? So, everything is based on cash balance anyway. You always have to make sure the cash is there to do the expense. So, when we stop a PO and we say no more, then January we can issue a new one. So, we've made sure there's enough appropriation to make sure that that's gonna happen. It's all about appropriation and cash.
We'll still have to do the year-end line item transfers to
Correct.
make sure that no line item within a fund
Correct.
ends up in the red.
Correct. And there will really be no changes to that process in the other funds as well. So, next year, that is still an allowable area of the statute that schools will do transfers per line item so that no line is in the negative. So that will still be a part of the normal January. What I will tell you is, the past, I've been here 8 years and I'd say 7 years. Our encumbrances have been very minimal with the exception of the CPF the CPF area. We try very hard to make sure we're year to year on a lot of our costs, and that naturally happens in December. So we're not talking drastic differences for the staff. It's just understanding the timing and that, don't do a lot of extra now because we'll save you the time because we're gonna have to do it in January anyway.
Unless they have a $500,000 central air unit go out or something like that.
Right. But we have that anyway because we have to stop purchasing to close out the year anyway. I will make a couple of notes in your budget for the board. In your budget packet, the CPF plan has changed dramatically. The Department of Local Government Finance has redeveloped the plan to provide us more flexibility in what we would like to do. I thought that was a huge change, a very nice change for them. I think it gives you the ability to see more of what you've been wanting to see. So that plan was designed partially by the Department of Local Government Finance, partly by me and Mr. Titterow. And what the goal is transparency to know what we are expecting to need, when we're expecting to need it, and in what areas those are supposed to be needed in. So the first few pages of that plan are required by the state. The others were developed by us, but you have to submit them and you have to make sure that you are consistent. So bar no major changes, we'll probably leave those plans as they are. But if you have questions on that, please don't hesitate to contact me. Those I hope are more clear for you as we look ahead. So.
Well, I think, with the bonding and us talking about capital or projects in the future and the project committee, I think I would think that we're gonna have some discussions about the capital projects expenses stuff anyway.
Yes, and there is a big piece that's changed. The state now requires that we have a listing of all capital assets or projects to be purchased or done over $10,000. So that's kind of a task to come up with. Mr. Titterow can tell you we talked long and hard and over about this because we don't want to get in a position where a boiler goes out and we can't pay for it because it's not on the list. And so we had to really think about those things that happen, that just happen, and get them on the list whether we actually do purchase or not. So that list is probably going to be a little longer than what we actually see in real costs that come up throughout the year. We do also, because all projects were required, if they were going to come of capital nature from the fund, we had to list everything that was on our project plan as well as what we had in capital projects under some needs, because we have not been able to determine for sure exactly which projects the bonds will pay for and which of those few projects we won't be able to do from the bonds that we may take on with capital funds. So those are the pieces that are new to the plan. That's why you will see them. Those are the important pieces according to the department, and they were mandatory. So that is a big change, but you will see that as part of your plan. Any other questions, comments?
I don't know, I get kind of concerned of, I mean, since I've been on the board, I haven't been overwhelmed with our capital long-term planning. And I don't know that this budget helps that situation, this new format. I mean, I think you have to be super disciplined on the capital side. Otherwise, those dollars just disappear into the other. I mean, there's always something else to spend money on. Capital, it's easy to not spend money on.
There has to be dollars to spend before that can happen. We can have a budget of $5 million, but when we're only bringing in 2.2, we really do, and of that 1 million is 1.3 million right now is utilities and insurance.
So business professionals, this has to be an issue. What mechanisms have they looked at to protect capital monies, I guess? Any?
My entire job is protecting the funds that we have, so I guess I need a little bit more information on what kind of question you're asking.
Yeah, well, we can talk later then.
I mean, I'm happy to answer that, I just don't know.
Well, I think he's kind of where I was. I think part of the thing that's going to give, we got the latitude now that we haven't had in years past because of
Levying
the
job.
severance bond. We have the ahead of us now for the next 12 months. We can start talking about what I've always wanted, the 3-year plan that meant
That's why
something.
the master planning
10-year
process
plan
is even
that
happening.
meant
Yeah.
something. You know, as we start looking at our next round of bonding, you know, as we're completing this section and we move into the next section, I'm going to start having, my questions are going to gear towards, okay, now that we got a capital projects plan that's got monies in it,
Right.
you know,
Yeah, we're in a completely different
this,
spot.
it's a whole different conversation
No
to me
question.
now, because now I got 2.7 million here or
Yep.
2.2 million here. I may say, let's not go for so much in the bonding, or it may reduce a renovation project's cost later on
Yeah.
if we plan more long-term. Is that kind of what you're?
Fixed patch and repair's been our only
Always
choice.
something else to spend, your money on.
Oh,
It's
right.
not capital. I mean, and we can, I mean, I'm not gonna play semantics, but I mean.
Right.
It, like the bonding, for instance, I mean, that was a pretty big deal, and that's coming to an end. In this new system, I guess, that we would just make a transfer.
Well, no, the transfer is only for the piece that's custodial, maintenance, school board, administration. It's very specific. That cannot happen just to go to capital funds. It has to happen to go to cover the expenses that used to be in the general fund. So that is very specific, that piece. Now, the piece that's transportation, we still have to transport our students. So we have a contract in place that drives our cost. We also, the capital piece, I think if you, did you take a look at this part of the plan?
I'm good. I don't want to spend any more time myself.
I
Thank you.
do want to cover it because it's very important and it is a very big change for us.
Absolutely.
The capital plan, we redeveloped this year so that you can see from 2019 all the way out to 2030 by type. So there's roofing, there's flooring, there's all of those things that we expect to see coming so that we can already have that information and start working as a board and as an administration, because it is a team process. This is the time. The budget is yours to help make. It is absolutely your role to help build that budget. There's no reason we can't have workshops in the spring to discuss this. There is no reason why you should ever feel in the dark, because that's why we did this, is so that you know every piece of that capital plan that is capital is here, that Mr. Tidrow expects to see needed in that area. So I think that this is a huge improvement. I think this is gonna help you guys see where those dollars are. What I will tell you is, you're right, there is always a way that you have to spend that money, and unfortunately right now, it's on patching and repairing emergency situations, because there's not a lot extra to do stuff that we just want to do. Hopefully with those
Starting to
levy
move there.
neutrality funds coming back, we're gonna have some of that. We're gonna be able to do a roof without having to worry about what isn't gonna happen the rest of the year. So, but take a look at this piece, because it is a big change, and I think that it's a good change. I think that this was one of the things that I wanted very badly in that plan, so that you can see really what we are thinking. All of it is very thought out and methodical. We're very careful about it, and so that will explain more to you, I think, about what you should see in the future, so we have conversation.
And we're all excited about the fact that we're gonna have money now to be able to do that and not just do the fix and repair and patch. And, I mean, I think Richmond schools over the last however many years we've committed to the pension bond, we've done an excellent job, though, of maintaining our buildings, as you saw in the evaluation that was done from Fannie and Howie through our master planning process. So kudos to everybody for making that work.
But it's time.
Yes, but we're looking forward to actually having dollars that we can intentionally put
Yeah,
into
that's-
things, so,
Right.
good. Thank you, Karen.
Anyone else? Okay, then I need to entertain a motion to close this public hearing.
I move to close the public hearing.
Okay, motion from Aaron Stevens. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second from Brad. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Any opposed? All right, so now we need to move to our action items that sort of support this.
Yeah, so now that Karen has rested for 15 seconds, action items 6.01 through 6.06 are all Karen with Ron jumping in as needed. And so I'd ask Karen if she would just work through those as we go. So, Karen?
Okay. There are quite a few. So, all right. The first being a resolution for the additional appropriation of funds amounting to not more than $5 million for the issuance of bonds in fall of 2018. All notices have been published, as is required by statute in our local Palladium item. So tonight I ask that you approve the resolution for additional appropriation as it has been presented.
I so make the motion.
All right, a motion from Jeff Slifer. Have a second?
I will second.
Second from Brad Walton. Any comments or questions about that? All right, all those in favor of adopting the additional appropriation resolution signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, 6.02.
Okay, this is a motion to adopt the final bond resolution. This resolution also contains approving the master continuing disclosure undertaking as required by statute. That final bond resolution also states that we will not exceed $5 million in bonds for the purpose of providing funds to be applied to the cost of projects of a capital nature. So tonight, I ask approval from the board for the adoption of the final bond resolution.
I so make that motion.
Motion
I
from
will
Jeff
second that
Slifer
again.
and a second from Brad Walton. Any comments or questions about that one?
Madam President?
Yes.
One of the things that we're doing is we make a commitment that during this calendar year, we will not borrow more than $10 million in tax-exempt obligations. And obviously, that's not going to be an issue, but it needs to be understood since that's a comfort resolution part of it. That makes this investment much more desirable for banks as it relates to their tax deductibility.
Understood. Okay. Thank you for that. All those in favor of adopting the final bond resolution as presented signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Okay, our next resolution is regarding the acceptance of post-issuance compliance procedures. This is a requirement by statute, and tonight I ask the board for approval of the resolution approving amended and restated post-issuance compliance procedures.
So moved.
Motion from Brad,
I second.
second from Dixie. Any comments or questions on this one? Okay, Okay, all those in favor of the resolution approving amended and restated post-issuance compliance procedures signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed?
All right. And we will move now into the area which would correspond more with the upcoming budget changes for January 1, 2019. Tonight before you is a resolution to establish the Education and Operations Fund. This establishment of funds is per House Bill 1009, where the governing body of each school corporation is to establish an education fund for the payment of expenses allocated to student instruction and learning under IC 20-42.5, and to establish an operations fund for the payment of expenses that are not allocated to student instruction and learning under IC 20-42.5. The newly established funds will replace the General Fund, Capital Projects Fund, Transportation Fund, and Bus Replacement Fund, effective January 1, 2019. Just a note to the board, we will have policy work after this fund is passed, as we will need to update some policies that contain old language effective January 1. We'll be working on that later this fall. So tonight, it's my recommendation that the board approves the resolution to establish the Education and Operations Fund as it's presented.
Do you have a motion?
I move to approve the resolution for the establishment of funds.
I will second.
Okay. Any questions on that one? All those in favor of approving the resolution to establish education and operation funds signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Okay, moving on. The next resolution is to establish initial funding for the Education Fund. Per House Bill 1009, the governing body of each school corporation is to establish an education fund for the payment of expenses allocated to student instruction and learning. The House bill also requires that the governing body of each school corporation transfer the December 31st, 2018 fund balances of the general fund to the education fund to be effective January 1st, 2019. Tonight I ask the board to approve the resolution to establish initial funding for the education fund as it has been presented.
I move that we adopt the resolution.
Okay, motion from Dixie Robinson,
Second.
second from Aaron Stevens. Any comments or question on this one? Jeffrey?
One of the thoughts as I was looking at the finances was the fact that I thought maybe we should be looking at possibly transferring any cash balance, or maybe not all of the cash balance, but into the rainy day after we have some kind of discussions on what we're going to reallocate and how we're going to do.
How often?
How, you know, because once I think we need to have conversations about what is going to be the adequate percentage now that we want to maintain for cash balance. I mean, there's a lot of questions that we need to ask. And I'm thinking to myself, it would be an appropriate time if we have something over some kind of percentage maybe be transferred into the rainy day fund. So even though this establishes the right for them to transfer the money, I guess what my suggestion is maybe we may look at not transferring all of it into the educational fund, but some into the rainy day fund.
And we can have further discussion on that when we have to pass the resolution for transfers. I think that's a completely accurate assessment of what our options are. So we can have further conversation when we discuss that.
Which means we'll have to have some other discussions before then.
Right.
Thank you.
All right. All those in favor of establishing the initial funding for the education fund, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Okay, my last resolution for the night is a resolution to establish initial funding for the operations fund. Per House Bill 1009, the governing body of each school corporation is to establish an operations fund for the payment of expenses that are not allocated to student instruction and learning under IC 20-42.5. The House bill also requires that the governing body of each school corporation transfer the December 31st, 2018 fund balances of the capital projects, transportation operating, and bus replacement funds to the operations fund effective January 1st, 2019. I might note to the board, as we discussed earlier during the public hearing, there is a March 1st deadline in which we have to transfer from the education fund to the operations fund. That transfer is not a part of this resolution. It has to be a separate transfer. So any funds that would cover operation costs that were in the general fund has to be a different resolution that we will discuss at a later time. So tonight, it's my recommendation that the board approve the resolution to establish initial funding for the operations fund as it's been presented.
Do I have a motion to,
So moved.
okay, Brad, second,
second.
and Jeff? Any questions about that one?
Well, my same comment applies to this as 6.04 or 6.05. So the proposed resolutions that you're talking about for the transfer because of the March 1st deadline will take place before December 31st or after December 31st?
We can determine that because the way that the resolution is stated, and this is something that was vetted with State Board of Accounts as well as Department of Local Government Finance, you actually have to put a percentage or a dollar amount, and you have to determine how frequent that transfer will occur. So my thought process is we will have to do an initial resolution to transfer whatever we determine as that first piece, and then we will also have each month an amount.
We can do a different amount each month.
Yeah, and that's where we can have further conversation, but it could be based on actual costs that we bring, like we do in January. We bring the December, we date it in December, but you sign it in January. We can do a flat amount, we can do a percent. There are options that we can discuss, but I would recommend that we have an initial resolution for a first time, and then we determine our
So with us
repetitive.
only having one board meeting in December, then we really need to be prepared by the end of November.
I would like to have conversation in October so that we
Okay.
can make things happen before November.
So we
that
can,
if
we can kind of
have-
tie that all together with what I'm talking about then.
Absolutely.
I'm good.
Okay. So all those in favor of approving the resolution to establish the initial funding for the operations fund signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right. Thank you, Karen and Ron. That's a start. Now we're to 6.07, which is the teacher appreciation grant policy.
I'm gonna ask Mrs. O'Brien if she would speak to this,
Let me have
please.
Karen speak on that, just,
She's done.
I just want to keep it consistent.
We gotta save some of her for executive session.
There you go.
So we did have some conversation about the, policy 3442, which is the teacher appreciation grant policy. Indiana code does require that we approve this policy on each year. At this time, we're not making any recommendations for any changes to the policy. We're just asking the board approve the teacher appreciation grant policy 3442 for the 18-19 school year.
Okay, do I have a motion to approve the teacher appreciation grant policy? Basically, we're approving it. You've already sort of introduced it, so.
I move that we approve the teacher appreciation grant.
Second.
Okay, any comments or questions on that?
Karen, do you want to interpret this? No, never mind.
All right, all those in favor of approving the teacher appreciation grant policy signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right. Our work session topic is sort of our topic, so, one of the things.
It is, but she also just mentioned about how she's gonna have to have more policies too.
That's right, that's right. Well, and that's, the good news is that this sort of loose recommendation from the executive group was that we create some sort of process that anyone could use for either introducing a new policy or asking for a change to a current policy. And we don't really have that procedure outlaid anywhere. And as I think I said in the notes, we were able to sort of run that by, oh gosh, her
Julie
name.
Slavens.
Julie Slavens, while we were sitting next to her, and just say, hey, what do others do? And she said, yeah, there's usually some sort of vetting event first. And she recommended it in writing, to say, hey, this is the new, I think we need, whoever it is, if it's Karen who says, hey, we need a new policy, and here's why, because there's been legislation, or if it's one of us that says, hey, we want, and there's several of them, not several, but 3 or 4 that folks have brought up that they want to be re-evaluated, or if it's someone from the general public that says, why don't you have a policy on XYZ? And so one of the things we discussed was some sort of process where a person could submit it in writing with a rationale. We need a new policy, we want to change this policy, I want us to look at this policy, and here's why. And then, and it would have to be, if you were going to do a small group was going to look at it, just for, is there any legal issue, blah, 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 and is that something that we need to move forward? It would need to be probably, it could only really probably be 2 members of the executive group. It probably needs to be the president and vice president, and maybe the superintendent and whoever else. Because if a board member was the one presenting a potential new policy, then that would put 4 board members in the room. So that would sort of change the idea of a pre-look at a proposed policy. And then that way, it could be either moved to the committee or it could be moved to the whole board to go forward. That was just one suggestion.
Well, we had, I don't want to interrupt you.
No, go ahead. I mean, I was looking in bylaws. I didn't see anything outlaid in bylaws. I don't see anything laid out in writing for that process.
But you've presented, a possible solution. We had this discussion when we went through all of the policies.
Right.
And at that point, it was determined, or I thought it was determined, that every board member was assigned 2 or 3 sections, 2000s or
Right.
whatever. And I thought it was then at that point that we were trying to encourage policy review in the section, because we've done nothing since we went through that whole barrage.
Right, that's the other part of this
And
conversation.
honestly, we went
Yep.
through the barrage so quickly that none of them got their due diligence probably, except for Dixie. She did an outstanding job and spent the time, and going back to on point, I kind of thought it was the feeling of the committee, of the board then, that was still going to be the process that we followed. Because I'm an avid believer that, especially as far as a board member goes, and even from central office, if one board member feels like that there should be a discussion about a board policy, as far as I'm concerned, as long as there's a second, then I think it deserves the right of the conversation of the board. To me, it's kind of like a vote. I'd like to have a discussion on XYZ. Well, like one of the ones that I would like to discuss is term limits.
Which there isn't a policy.
There isn't a policy for
And
term
it would
limits.
be above and beyond state statute.
So,
It's not a proper thing for policy, but I think the discussion can still take place. Or cannot affect term limits via its ability to enact policy. At least that's my thought, and I think ISBA agrees with it.
Kind of what we heard too.
I didn't catch what you said, I'm sorry.
Well, term limits is a valid discussion point. I just don't think it cannot be, if there were a majority or consensus to move forward with some kind of term limit provision, it's not a matter of board policy. It has to involve an amendment to our organizational plan that has to get filed with the State Department of Education, or the State School Board Association.
So that goes more to the governing document of.
Yeah, it's our organizational plan.
Yeah.
But
That's still controlled. to the-
That's still got to be initiated by.
Right,
It's
right.
just not
By
a
you
policy.
folks.
I was thinking for a minute I had a bad example.
No, I mean, I think it's a good discussion point. I just want to understood that there's going to be a little more to it than just a matter of two
On that
readings on a policy that
On
creates
that
term
particular
limits.
policy,
This
yeah.
one, and I don't think there's any issue about approving it at the state Board of Education. I mean, aren't many, but there are a few school corporations that have term limits.
6
So without that one
Six
being the,
of 300
maybe a
plus.
bad example.
Not necessarily.
That one may be a little bit more involved, but I mean, you know, I just think if that is a thought of one of the member, any policy like that, and then a second board member says that, yeah, I agree, I think that warrants at least some discussion and some rationale, as you said.
And that's what we were discussing, is where does the rationale for that come? Does it come before, after, during? Does it go to the small groups first? Does it go to the executive group first? That's the question.
Because there needs to
Because
be.
do we all vote on whether it moves forward, or is it vetted first?
It's gonna be hard to have a process between the revisions, the requirements by the state, the add-ons. I mean, each one of the processes, I mean, because if Karen, using Karen as an example, says, oh, because of the new operational educational funds, you have to change this policy.
Right.
Well, okay, there's maybe some latitude in how that policy is created, but the statute is gonna say.
So legislative required could possibly look different
So
than
that at that point,
a
it becomes
recommendation
a
from a-
non-board really approval, but it becomes a committee discussion on.
almost an edit.
Yeah, it becomes a committee discussion on what we want in it or what not we want in it. So I guess it's a long story to say, it's gonna be kinda tough to create one situation fits all. That's a long way to get around to that, I guess.
I mean, I thought when we were having those discussions, it was policies can basically be brought up any time. To add another layer of committee, I mean, I'm not sure, I think if the public has an issue, I mean, we represent them, I think they could come to a board member that could represent that policy. I don't know if we would do like quarterly or monthly, have an agenda item policy, then if someone had something, they could bring it forward. If they got a second, there could be some discussion and then move towards creating a policy, adjusting a policy or whatnot.
Or researching it.
Yeah, but, I mean, I don't know if there's a right answer, just, but to have another committee, executive or not, I mean, I don't think it's gonna be that high volume of an item, I guess.
Let me throw something out, because you've mentioned if a board member brings it forth and there's a second, normally that implies that
That there would
that
be a
means that there's a
vote.
vote. And if there's a vote and it fails, then what's the recourse?
Well, I wasn't really thinking so much as a vote, is that just as long as it was more than one board member.
I mean, yeah, if I wanted to change our colors or something and no one, I mean, that's just something ridiculous, we wouldn't waste time talking on that.
Right, but
But
where
it-
does
but-
that stop? That's
Let
my
me scratch
point
that
about
one
it.
And my thing is if you bring it up for discussion, I think the rest of the board members would like to know, where is this, at least I would, where is this coming from? I mean, why do you wanna do it? How can you talk about it if you don't know?
Yeah, there'll have to be that.
So,
Yeah,
would
where
it,
you're
would it
coming
be to, where Jeff was coming out with the second, would it be a board member would ask for a review of the policy and discuss, and then if it's not seconded, or say, I would motion,
See, you're voting on a policy,
Yeah.
or voting on a revision, or voting on a review, and
Or
I don't
even
know.
a discussion.
I would motion to discuss, or if you could, I don't know if that's a thing.
Move to discuss?
I would move to discuss policy 10,054 school colors, I don't know, whatever that is.
I would
Careful.
suggest that you consider maybe amending your bylaws and creating a policy for modifying policies.
Well, and actually, that's what Julie recommended, was
Policy.
to create a
What would you
Procedures.
do?
policy development policy, basically, a policy development
Yeah,
procedure.
but yeah, run around, how would we introduce that to?
Well, I mean, I think,
Well, this is the first step, is the
Okay.
discussion.
I mean, I think I think I could see our office at least putting an initial draft together. I can see a motivated board member putting an initial draft together, and we could, and everybody would then weigh in on that draft, but of the bylaws, policy, and
But if we-
procedures.
I agree with that. I think that's a good approach.
If we reviewed policies quarterly, and that date, we knew, then I could submit to the exec board, these are policies I'm interested in looking at or have questions about, can you put them on that list? That could be then distributed to the entire board, so they would know ahead of time, at least a brief abstract of the thought was behind.
And I think to what Dixie was saying, on instead of just listing 3 policies, would you list your rationale of why we should be reviewing those policies to where we would know where somebody's coming from? Which I think makes sense, so,
And
I didn't want to speak for you.
when
but
we
that-
review policies,
Okay.
I think one of the purposes for me, for the need to review a policy, is changing situations in the community or in the corporation, whether it be finances, population, or something else. It would say, the state has enacted a new law or something like this that we really need to amend our policy on. And that's where I come from when I think, hey, okay. Several years ago, it was dress code. I used that, okay? There were valid community concerns for that. Several years ago, there was the backpack policy, okay? There was a valid concern and a rationale for going to these things. No more blue cars on the parking lot. Please give me a rationale as to why, why we need to do that, or why we need to change an existing policy. That's where I come from on that.
And the rationale needs to be one of substance, not of one of whether you agree or disagree with it. That
Right.
becomes the discussion for the board and the vote of the majority of the board.
And I guess that makes sense to me, and in some ways, you're still sort of engaging the executive group as the agenda setting group. If you have whatever, and again, we need to create, I think, a policy, which is what Julie said, was we probably ought to have some sort of a policy development policy.
I think what you would focus on would be what would be the process that you think is appropriate. And then, once you've identified the procedures and process, then you can flesh in the policy aspects of
Right,
that
and
procedure.
make sure we're still following all the rules and all that sort of thing,
So do we go to Ron and ask him for an initial?
And I can type up those notes.
Type up your notes, or anybody wants to shoot their ideas, and then you'll at least have something substantive to look at and react
Right.
to.
And Julie offered to gather other corporation policies from
That'd be
around the
great.
state.
I mean, no need to reinvent the wheel.
She did, so I think that's
So
a good
maybe,
place to
I think
start.
you were gonna contact
I
her
wa-
for
I
that,
am,
and
as soon
then
as we had this
she
conversation.
can share those with you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that makes sense.
Which
And
I
I do
think-
agree using using a structure that's already in place is a smart idea rather than creating more, and I get that. I just know that she seemed to feel fairly strongly about that idea of, submitting it, if you will, I guess, with a rationale, so that people would actually understand, like you said, substantively, why do we think this needs to be changed or added or whatever. Legislative aside, as you said, that's kind of a different animal. We have to do this because the language just changed legislatively.
But it
And
still
she's
needs to be
there.
included in the process.
Agreed. And really, if we do create a timeline, whatever that, and I agree with that as well, John, that we need to build that into our agenda on a regular basis. So we just need to decide what that is. So quarterly, if that,
Well, it
which
should be
based
tied-
on what we've done, the cleanup we did, quarterly might be okay, or maybe it's,
Well, should we, in our bylaws, actually put in concrete what our policy review process is?
yes, I think that's what,
And,
that's
you know,
what
term
he
limits is something
recommended.
I would like to address before I'm possibly not reelected, so I guess,
And how many terms will that be now?
well, this will stop me from, in case I win, doing another.
Is that
term.
what it is?
No, but I
As
just,
Ron said,
So we're gonna
that's
have a
not
policy
really
for
a,
one
but that one's a little deeper, so
but it's
that-
not a policy conversation at this point, that's
It's
actually
not a policy
changed.
conversation. I talked to, I looked at the statute, and I didn't think it was, and I talked to Julie,
She said the same thing.
and she indicated that those few school corporations that had done it, did it through the State Board of Education, amending their organizational plan.
And you said how many have it?
I think,
She did say
six,
six of
and as I spoke with ISBA and SBI, I spoke with Julie as well as Lisa and a few other people, as well as NSBA. And one of the concerns that you come up, term limits and exact, specifically, is with the push right now statewide to everything to politicize the position of the state superintendent of education, as well as governor appointing the educational board for the state of Indiana. The one thing about the great thing about our position that we hold is it is the one real, truly unadulterated elected position in the state of Indiana that is not tied to a political party.
But that's come up.
It has.
I know,
in
but as of
legislation.
right now, it is not. And the discussion, everything went from the fact that we cannot vote ourselves a raise. We can't vote ourselves a raise. We can't vote ourselves other things. And because of that, the person who applies, puts their name on a ballot for a school board position, they do so with a heartfelt feeling that they're doing it for kids, they're doing it for this or that. So whether a person sits in a position for 4 years or for 40 years, nothing changes from day one to the 40th year about that, unless all of a sudden there's a new law by the state of Indiana that would say these positions, these elected positions, are now all of a sudden are going to be tied to party affiliations.
That'd be
And
weird.
it gets into a,
Yeah, I think that's the reason for us to have a discussion, because I'm sitting here thinking that, 3 consecutive terms or something like that, 4 consecutive terms, I think that's a fair compromise. I think after a period of, I wasn't gonna file for reelection. The bonding came up, the financing came up, I had some encouragement, and it would have been nice, but I mean, I believe in term limits. I believe every office should have term limits, so I believe that's a discussion that's worthwhile. So, that's my rationale, by the way.
It's in the minutes.
Just for the next guy.
Not for me.
Well,
So, go ahead, Dixie.
Sorry, I did want to clarify the policy review that we did this past year, that for the entire policy manual, that was more a legal cleanup and with new laws, as well as things that no longer existed. We had policies we didn't need. Duplications, repetitions, things like that. When we assign the policy sections to the groups, that's where the intensive review, especially on local policy, should come in, and where you could bring up policies that you felt needed more intense review. But what we did was, that was more just legal cleanup and getting rid of stuff we no longer needed, because that policy manual was getting pretty hefty. And adding the things that we had to have.
I think there's a cycle to when ISBA issues its policy manuals too, and so
It's
we might want to clarify that with Julie or Lisa, and then think about incorporating your timeline. I don't know that the timeline necessarily needs to be
But
in the
chunks,
bylaws
yeah.
as much as there needs to be an understanding of what the expectation is.
Because hers actually are
How it's going to be
quarterly
regularly
too,
addressed, as
right?
John points out, not just
Yeah.
sit on the shelf until something happens that makes you have to do something.
Well, or till we get to the point like we were, where you have to do the whole
Well, and I think the other thing is important too, is that we build in a way to, if there's something that comes up, like for instance, the policy for the grant that we just talked about tonight, well, we couldn't have waited until the quarterly time rolled around, because that
Right.
was immediate action required. So I think we've gotta have, yes, we'd like to just do it quarterly, or
Contingency
whatever you
plan or
guys
whatever.
decide to do.
Yeah.
But as soon as you say that's the only time, there's gonna be an exception.
right.
So we just need to build in a way for that to happen.
Thank you for that, that's a good point, very good point. Needs to be dealt with right now because of whatever circumstance, so. Okay, how about I'll kind of type up these notes for all of us, and then I will get some examples from Julie as well, and then I'll share those with everyone, and we can move forward. I think
Try to
we
have
could-
something by the second meeting next month.
Yeah.
At the latest, so you'll have
Right.
something to react to.
I think that'd be great. And I'll just send, I'll shoot her an email tomorrow and, or tonight if I think I can get that pulled off. So, it sounds good to me.
On a lighter note, with a little bit of humor before we close, all comments and concerns can be directed to board member Aaron Stevens, aaron.s@rcs.k12.in.us. He is the one who mentioned that bad word of dress code, so we won't go there.
That's
Oh,
okay,
that's
we
so
were
far
talking
beyond.
about,
Just an example, just trying
Or-
to, trying to get a little humor here, guys.
don't
Or
forget
John
Jeff
Weber,
mentioned changing the colors, or
John
somebody mentioned
Weber,
changing
you know,
the
John
colors.
Weber wanted to change it, yeah,
Uh-huh.
that's John W. Adams.
These are not official actions, just.
Move on before the mascot.
Absolutely.
Exactly. Yeah,
Black as an
That's the
accent
next
would-
one.
Would be positively thought as,
Oh, I got you, adding,
not today.
Oh, now he's trying to defend his
okay.
example.
Is there any
That's his rationale.
old business that fits, that
Black
anyone
Trail,
has to address?
Old business?
Let me know if you need help.
Preview of upcoming,
The old business,
Oh,
that we
yeah.
want to talk about.
oh, the conference.
Conference, I
Yeah,
mean,
that, go ahead.
share some things.
I know, one part is probably Todd's bell ringer, but how about what you all,
Okay, yeah,
Brought-
the one part we won't talk about.
Please, don't blow it.
don't
So
steal his
You'll have
bell
like 30
ringer.
seconds to figure out a new one.
But your reaction to, the professional development, I think would be good.
Obviously, you take more out of certain breakout sessions than others.
Always.
It was pretty funny. There was one session Aaron and I walked into, and Dixie and Debbie and Todd were all in there too. It was like, wow, we were all interested in the same one, so we got up and left and went to a different one. But a couple I went to, I thought was really interesting, was the morning session that I went to was, let's see, it was, I didn't intend on going to it, but actually a Richmond High School alumni put it on, was the cybersecurity, building a strong digital ecosystem and data privacy culture. I learned a lot of things in there that obviously Rob already knows, so I'm not throwing this out here for him, I'm throwing it out for us because it really opened my eyes to a lot of things. Within the next couple of years, you know, the passwords we have of capital letter, lowercase letter, special thing, and a number, probably going to be going away. Everything's going to be going to a 4-word
Saying, slogan.
yeah, just 4 random words as your password. So go like mug, computer, can, bottle. And so that, yeah, go ahead, that's mine, yeah. But those passwords that we thought were really secure by having those random numbers and letters, a computer only takes 3 days to hack that. 4 random words, it's gonna take a computer 550 years to hack that.
Until tomorrow.
Until tomorrow, until they have a new computer. It was really cool to hear that, and he's the IT director at Lawrence Township, and one of the problems they've had is, you know, when we were in school, it was if you didn't want to take a test, you called or pulled a fire alarm or something, and did that kind
You
of
did,
thing.
did you?
Well, I didn't, but, you know, that was always an issue of
B.
some of the stuff.
Walton at
Yeah, exactly. So one of the problems he's seeing right now is like, is the, was it DDoS, the direct disruption of service? Is it, right? Where there's like things kids can do, and like for like $10, put a parent's credit card on it, and like it's crazy some of the stuff that things can do, to where it's amazing. And the amount of stuff that I saw that we didn't even know existed, that better respect for you, Rob, that you guys deal with. And
That is also in the
hey,
minutes.
now that word was better. You don't know where you started, so.
Thank you, Mr. Walton.
But it was kind of eye-opening to see just the amount of things that go into the cybersecurity, and we do a really good job here.
If
And
we
then-
opened up our filter right now for 5 seconds, we would probably have 100,000 messages in this.
Right,
So
and then
that's-
one thing he thought was,
What'd you say, 90% of the email we get
At least
is
90%.
every day?
yeah.
Is
Useless or
One thing he did,
That's-
that they do
So they get
is
through.
every month, they send out examples of the clickbait so that their staff can see it. Because so much of it looks like it's directly from legit websites and things of that nature, to where they send that out so the staff can actually say, hey, don't click on stuff like this, and explain what to look for
Do
in
they
the
do a
emails.
test with their staff? I mean, 'cause
Yes, they do a
county, we-
test
We
of it.
send out
Exactly.
those bait, if you will, emails to see who's gonna open them and use that as a learning experience.
Right, exactly. It's really kind of neat, the system they have involved there. I thought that was really cool. And then, the other one I really got a lot out of was in the afternoon on Monday. It was the locally created pathways, creating a graduation pathway for your local context. So, up in Wadney Community Schools up north, where their RV industry's huge. One of the pathways, and it took them about 3 months to get this done, so it's actually a fairly quick process, to where you could have, in my world, you've got the construction pathway, you've got the electrical pathway, things like that. They actually created RV construction.
Right.
To where they went to a local businesses, but they had, I think it was Thor Construction was the, basically the big partner with them. They developed a state curriculum for basically what they wanted to see. So it included like the construction demographic with electrical one, and then they had one also in there as the building and facilities maintenance, to where by putting those two classes together, they were actually able to give kids a different career path option in their with the context, and actually giving them a gateway to get their degree. And they had about 40 kids going through that.
Now, was that associated with like an Ivy Tech, like a technical
They did.
college?
They were getting some credit hours for the electrical class through Ivy Tech. And then what they were also doing with the partnership with, I think there's 4 or 5 different manufacturers up there, they are guaranteed, if they get a degree and have that pathway, they are guaranteed a interview. And by interview, they mean you've got a big star on your resume, it goes to the top of the stack, you're calling in, unless you just absolutely bomb that interview, they're gonna hire you.
Students know that going in?
Yes, and they're starting somewhere around $17 to $24 an hour, depending on what
That's a plus.
they fall into, which is unbelievable. And I was talking with their superintendent afterwards. I said the biggest problem you're going to have is keeping teachers, because they're going to want to do that same thing and get into that making $30, $40 an hour down the lines. So it's crazy. I listened to him last year with I think it was Elkhart, who's partnered with was it Rolls-Royce and Subaru, same issue. The kids were guaranteed interviews and starting out at $60K on the start, so it was amazing. So I just kind of thought that along the lines of something that maybe we need to start looking at with the Blue Buffalo and things of that nature coming in, and
I know Todd's worked with the Manufacturing Matters and
the
that,
partners
so-
we've had in the past.
On the students we had this year
A-House.
with Belden, who
Yes.
are working there now and have full-time positions waiting on them once
Yeah,
they
the
graduate.
thing that's glaring with me is the 300 open positions in Wayne County in the manufacturing industry. I mean, we should be a pipeline for these guys to.
Are they at that same salary level? thinking they
Some
weren't.
are closer to that than others. I know Blue Buffalo, the average wage starting there is around, I want to say 17 to 20, somewhere in there, for starting. But the average wage for people with experience is somewhere in the mid-20s there.
Okay.
So.
How about you, Aaron, Dixie? Who else went?
Well,
Todd?
I just wanted to tie in with Brad. I sent mine out by email to
Yes,
all
you
of
did.
them. But I did want to tie in with Brad on the cybersecurity, that the general session speaker, keynote speaker the first day, as far as school security is concerned, he said cybersecurity is becoming as important as just the regular type school security. That's moving up the list quickly.
And also about the school safety specialist.
Yes, I wanted to bring that up too, because the state requires a school safety specialist in each district. He recommended that you need one in every building. Richmond Community Schools has one in every building. We should be very proud of that.
I don't know of any other schools in the area that have one in every building either.
No,
so.
and I think that at some point, I would like to see the safety specialists brought in for recognition by the board. I don't think people know how many we have, so it's really
I
nice.
don't know whose idea that was, but that was a heck of an idea.
Thank you very much.
That's
Tying
Todd
in
Terrell
with-
at RC.
Tying in with school safety for one thing, of course, that's near and dear to my heart. I enjoyed the keynote speaker, and especially the cute flashes of his child and his wife and the stories. But you know, I learned a new reality of that. When we think of school safety, we think of, you know, mass shootings and other acts of violence too, but we fail to remember that also a part of the school safety dialogue is emergency weather preparedness, electrical outage preparedness, and how that relates to what goes on in a building,
And background checks.
background checks, more thorough background checks. The people, you know, if you do it just state and local and you only do it in those senses, there's a lot of people who go through the crack, get through the crack. And unfortunately, you find out not long afterwards that, yeah, they're more heinous, heinous issues in their background. Needless to say, I also attended the Delegates Assembly, and I will be sending, I did not get the chance yesterday or today to type up a report, but I will be sending it to you, including some of the upcoming things and the probability of moving the ADM count from September whenever to September the 1st, which would be beneficial, more beneficial to all schools, including, and then additional grants that are going to be made equally available to rural schools that currently are only available to larger school corporations and urban schools, including things like monies available for safe schools and school safety. So let me see what else. Other policies, some policy changes and legislative changes, but they're in my notes. I'll get them up to everybody so you'll know what they are. It was a good session.
And our state superintendent, who was the keynote speaker for the second day, gave an update on Indiana's public education. But if you get on the IDOE website, which board members should do every once in a while, and kind of delve into that and see what's on there, what's changing, what's up, who does what, there's lots of information on that website that kind of helps you understand what's going on.
Well, thanks for attending. I'm glad that it was useful for y'all.
I will say one other thing. We are highly respected amongst other corporations of our size around the state, not just in central Indiana, because when I'm speaking with superintendents and board members, and especially people from ISBA, they refer to us, you should see what Richmond is doing. You should see how they're handling this. You should see what their board has been able to do over the last 10, 15 years in this, and if you have questions, you should ask them. This isn't just coming from ISBA, this is from others. We've got a lot of advocates out there, from other corporations as well, who are looking at what we do on a regular basis and saying, hey, it's working over there, so let's try it.
It's awesome.
That's a great point.
Oh,
There's
and
even what's called, as you go into bargaining season right now, the Richmond Reset. which is heard from
That's
as
awesome.
far north as you go to as far south as you go in the state of Indiana. So we're groundbreaking and trendsetting
that's
in
very
a
cool.
lot of areas.
And one other thing, we, last year, did attain master board status.
Yes.
It was in the book. We were one of 2 in the state. So that's there too.
Nice.
Just can't drop it now.
Where's that
That's
plaque?
right.
Where is that plaque?
Over there somewhere. So, preview of upcoming meeting and events.
The one thing that I have on here is just a reminder that September 20th, we do bargaining, and that's why we need to decide if the board is going to have a representative or representatives, and then who is going to be a part of that. So
And I really
keep that in mind, that's coming up.
meant to
next
make
week.
a couple phone calls and ask that, because we definitely need to decide that, so. I will talk to you all the next day or so.
Homecoming parade?
Next Wednesday. Let us know if you guys want to be in it.
I want to.
Okay.
I need to get hold of Mr. Lambright. Early College has asked me to drive my truck and trailer for them, so I'll be driving that, so I don't know if we can get.
Put your
maybe-
banner on the
You might,
side.
you might do
Maybe
that
get-
soon because he
Right.
just sent an email
Yep.
today.
That way maybe I can get right in behind you guys, and
That'd be cool.
so we're all together.
That'd be great.
Suzanne, I'm gonna start shopping for lots of candy.
Okay, so we have a press conference. We have a press. Do you have any questions? Okay.
Poke your eye out.
And we should
some Smarties.
probably talk about our bell ringer.
Yeah,
which
so
I
our
think
bell
is
ringer
cool.
tonight, Tuesday, we took Mike Shunnison, Jeremy Hill, and then 3 students, Isaiah Cox, George Dickman, and Alex Eastman, to the conference, and kind of a different approach that's not typical at the school board and superintendent's conference. And they presented on our technology teams at the secondary schools. We had video from the intermediate levels, and then Isaiah, George, and Alex and Mr. Hill did the majority of the talking and presenting, did a phenomenal job. You guys would have been proud. I know the 4 that were there attended that session, and the kids were amazing. People were very impressed with what we offer here at Richmond Community Schools, especially at Richmond High School, and all the different alternatives we have for kids to be involved, and even to graduate with diplomas and not spend 8 hours or 7 hours in the high school, and just some different opportunities there. So I don't know if any of you want to comment on what you saw that day, but so impressed with the guys and the work that they were doing. So
It's not so much what we saw, it's what we heard while we were sitting.
People sitting behind us were just amazed at the students that presented, how professional they were, how polished of speakers they were, and the fact that, you know, the thing they stressed a lot was the students teaching teachers, or the teach-a-teacher program, and they were just mind-boggled by it, and it was really impressive to hear the comments from the people. You know, like, we're sitting here, and so the people behind us, they're kind of talking to each other underneath their breath, and I mean, just we could hear what they're saying. It was just kind of had a grin on your face, because to hear the compliments the kids were getting, it was impressive.
and kudos to our teachers for being willing
Getting them
to
prepared, exactly.
to be willing to be taught by the students.
No
Yes.
question.
Yeah,
You know?
you gotta check your humility at the door a little bit.
Yeah. But wow, what an opportunity.
You know, I think Alex Eastman's resume includes being on the speech team or whatever. And I've known him for a long time, seen his growth. But until he got up there in front of a microphone after he put the coffee down.
I'm telling you, that kid didn't have that coffee cup away from his mouth for more than 5 seconds at any time. I was like, oh my God, he's gonna be jacked. I'm just waiting for him just to be like, ah! Just he nailed it. He was really
But
composed, really cool.
Oh, wow. His presentation, you would have thought this guy was a polished public speaker, which obviously he is, because
Very
he
cool.
stood up in front of everybody and delivered a very, very outstanding message.
So proud.
Awesome. All right, with that note, we are adjourned.